everyone. Welcome to the 1570 Project. I have back today Paul Craney from Mass Fiscal. We're going to talk about a few things today that have been kind of in the news. First of all, I'm really excited about the SCOTUS rulings this week. Good news all around on kind of some of these big cases that we'd been waiting the whole session to hear from SCOTUS on this stuff. And really, the two big ones that I've been excited about are the case that's about the Arizona election laws that ruled that, yes, in fact, states can put reasonable limitations on voting, like that you have to vote in your own precinct and you have to fill out your own absentee ballot, that an activist who works for one of the candidates can't help you by doing it for you. You know, some of these kind of reasonable restrictions that people were trying to get thrown out as being so-called racist election laws. The Voting Rights Act was found not to apply to these laws because they're not really racist laws. And I mean, I don't know, Paul, maybe you can speak to this a little, but honestly, like, I just don't even understand this argument that having to vote in your precinct is racist. I don't get it. I can't understand where they're coming from on this.
I don't understand it either, because it also just makes it sound like, if that's true, that we're being racist for saying that you have to vote within your precinct, then you're alluding to the fact that people in the minority community can't put their ballots in the right precinct, which I think is kind of insulting, to say the least. And I say this because, I'm half Mexican, my mother's from another country. This is something that I've never heard of having an issue with. But you're right.
Basically, find
the
your
Supreme
voting
Court
place,
just decided
right?
that states. Yeah, I can. I can find it.
I mean, yeah, I don't get what the argument is, but I mean, like, everybody that I follow on Twitter who's left of center is like freaking out about this. I mean, NPR's headline was something like, the Supreme Court guts the Voting Rights Act. And like, I just don't see how that's that. I mean, the Voting Rights Act has existed and these rules have existed in Arizona. These aren't like some new rules that came into play because Trump lost in 2020. These are rules that have been on the books a long time. I think the ballot harvesting one is since 2016, because there were actually some issues in 2016 with groups, including Republican groups in some states like North Carolina, doing bad things with ballot harvesting that really weren't correct. And so they put this rule in 2016, but the rule that you have to vote in your precinct has been around even longer than that. I don't even think it's like written into the law. That's just like how it works. You vote at your voting place, and if you vote somewhere else, it doesn't count. Like, I don't understand what they want voting places to do.
Yeah, I agree. And also, I think we talked about one time before on the show, the more you loosen up and you make it, quote, easier to vote, the more transparency you want with the process. And when you start doing stuff where people can vote outside their precinct, I have to imagine the vast majority of people are going to start looking at this pretty skeptically, and rightly so. And when you do that, you take away the confidence in the system. I mean, that's not what you want.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I think that's something that plays into what we're seeing with ranked choice voting too right now. I mean, so we dodged this bullet thanks to work of people like you in Massachusetts that fight for transparency here in this state, but New York City is doing it for their mayoral election. And wow, what a mess that is. I can't even get over it that we're more than a week out from their election and we have no idea who even won. They've screwed up the count by hundreds of thousands of votes. They have hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots to count. They don't know, it's looking like the person who was ahead maybe isn't going to win, but it depends. And, if somebody else ends up in second place, then maybe they could. It's just ridiculous. And what were they thinking putting forward this system? I can't even imagine it.
I think for a lot of people, history starts for them right now, and they never look back and realize why certain events took place. In the city of Worcester, they had ranked choice voting, and it was an absolute disaster. They had hundreds of candidates running. The city of New York City actually did have ranked choice, I think in the 30s and 40s.
Oh, wow.
They clearly got rid of it. And in 2019, they decided to bring it back, and this is the first election. Now, what's significant about this is that this happens to be the largest ranked choice election in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the first one in New York City. Like you said, frankly, if it can't work there, I just don't think it can work in general. A lot of jurisdictions that have experience with it, a lot of politicians, they don't like it because although it has some curb appeal and the goals of ranked choice are pretty appealing, the benefits aren't really there. And we're seeing that this week where almost 2 weeks out, we still don't know exactly who won. And it's just a mess. It's just absolute mess. You're making a system that is fine, that works, may have some flaws. You're making it really complicated. And this is the end result that you have.
Well, yeah, it's like you put people in charge who are these like egg-headed think tank type of people, and they come up with this brilliant plan to like make elections work so much better, and they're super smart. So we'll come up with this super smart idea where we'll let people rank everybody, and then we'll have instant runoffs where we drop people. And like, it seems good on paper, but in practice, people don't want to have to know about 75 different candidates that are appearing on their ballot to put them all in order. You know, they know about maybe their favorite one or two people, and they don't want to deal with having to rank all these different people that they've never heard of. And then their ballot ends up being exhausted halfway through. They're out of choices, so it doesn't end up counting in the final thing anyway. Whereas, you know, and I was thinking about this a lot with New York. Like, people might not, like, they go out to vote for somebody that they like, that's their candidate, and they kind of heard of the ranked choice voting thing, but they don't know that much about it, so they just end up putting down, you know, their favorite person and leaving the rest blank. And it might have turned out that if you had a real runoff election, that person might have actually had a preference in the runoff when they were exposed to news cycles that featured just those two candidates and compared and contrasted them together, versus like having to go through your ballot and think about every hypothetical matchup between people and how you would rate them between each other. It's a lot of work for the average voter. And I just think, like, have these people ever met a voter? Because I've knocked a lot of doors in Massachusetts and people do not want to do this work. It's like already hard to get people to go out and vote and know about like any down ballot races, any additional third party candidates. Like, look at how third party candidates usually do. They usually are so low in name recognition. It's very, very difficult for them to break through. But now you're like asking people to put all this work into all these candidates. It's like very demanding on the electorate in a way that only somebody who's never actually talked to a human voter could possibly come up with. And I think the issues are so clear now. I hope this finally like does away with this system for people pushing this system on us everywhere. But I know you were tweeting today about how the Boston Globe is like, don't blame ranked choice voting. This is not ranked choice voting's fault. Ranked choice voting is still very, very good.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But you're so right. In an idealistic world, we would study all the candidates, we would learn all their positions, and we'd be able to rank them, but that's just not reality. I heard the proponents say last year during the election cycle when this was on the ballot in Massachusetts, it's like ranking your favorite ice cream flavors, you know, chocolate, vanilla, etc., strawberry. But, you know, that's with the understanding that you've tasted all those flavors and you do have that ability.
Also, people like ice cream.
You may want to in your audience.
Yeah. People don't even like politicians. Like, they don't want to spend a ton of their time. Like, if you were ranking a bunch of ice cream flavors, you would like go out and try a bunch of ice cream because that's like fun to find out about different ice cream flavors. But having to spend my life researching obscure politicians is just like, no one wants to do that. But people who live in like political science land, like, just are in denial about this. They think everybody in America is the people on Twitter, and it just isn't so.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And that's why the Boston Globe, again, editorialized about it today. They know virtually none of the facts that are happening in New York City, but they're saying please trust that the system works, just there are some people that don't know how to implement it. Well, the fact that people don't know how to implement it says the system doesn't work. And we don't know if how many of these ballots were exhausted, which is what you were talking about, how many people voted in error, they made mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to take a while to figure out. And I can guarantee you it's definitely going to happen because it's the first election.
Well,
It's
right.
just naturally going to happen. It takes a lot to get people used to voting that way.
Well, right. And so what's happening now is they're talking about, who's going to win the final matchup between Garcia and Adams. But it could turn out once they count all the absentee ballots, Garcia might not even end up in second place. It could be Maya Wiley in second place, in which case, Eric Adams probably has a better chance of winning. But because you don't know, and because you have hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots to count before you can even know who's in which place order, then you're really in trouble in terms of transparency of people like knowing where things stand, which gets back to what you were saying, like the trust and transparency in elections. People were criticizing Eric Adams for saying that there was a problem with the ballots and saying like, oh, this is like Trump not trusting elections. Well, maybe people don't trust elections because you do it in the most obscure and insane way possible. Like, think about it a little bit. Why do you think people aren't trusting this process?
Yeah. Alice, this was obviously in the ballot in Massachusetts last year, and as you said, we dodged a bullet with it. Which I'm so glad the Massachusetts voters overwhelmingly rejected this proposal. In fact, some of the Massachusetts cities also rejected it. Lowell rejected it recently, and like I said, Worcester had it, got rid of it a long time ago, generations ago. But the ranked choice does have a lot of curb appeal. If you listen to advocates, they make it sound like it's really good. The three biggest things they say is that it will select a candidate that has majority support. The second is that allows less negative campaigning. And the third is that it doesn't allow spoiler candidates. Those are the three big things, and all of them are actually really false. The only way, the biggest obviously benefit is that it picks a majority candidate. The only way it can ever get to a majority candidate is by slowly disqualifying ballots along the way. So they lower the amount of ballots that are eventually counted. That's how they get to that. The problem with that is that there's a lot of circumstances where it's really hard to predict who are the last two candidates standing. There's definitely some situations you can predict, and you would enjoy a ranked choice election. I often said last year when we're debating this issue with the advocates that, I happen to be conservative. I have some friends who, supported President Trump that are Republican, and some that are Republican that didn't support him. Under ranked choice, the folks that are upset at President Trump that are conservative could have voted for a libertarian on the first ballot and voted for Trump the second. Clearly, Trump is still going to win the Republican or conservative vote. That's an example of ranked choice, giving people an option to blow off some steam. The problem with these ranked choice votes is that it's really hard to predict in most situations who are the last two people standing. And the clearest picture I could give people is, remember the Democrat primary for president? There's about 20 candidates running. Even in Massachusetts, when we had our primary on the Democrat side, we had a lot of viable candidates. Right. Elizabeth Warren, I think, got in third place. So it's really hard if you're voting in an election like that to know who are the last two people standing, and making sure that you are picking the proper people standing at the end. Because if you're not, your ballot will get disqualified along the way in order to find who has the most votes. So that makes it really hard. That's the number one appeal to ranked choice voting, and it's it's not quite what they advertise. The second thing is negative campaigning. They say, if you have to have candidates all working together to get your second, third, fourth place votes, they're going to be less negative campaigning. That's just not true. In fact, Maine has had ranked choice voting for, I think, 3 cycles now. And all what really happens is that instead of candidates contrasting themselves in maybe a hard-edged way, a very pointed way, now super PACs are the ones that are doing the negative campaigning. So you're just allowing an outside voice to come into these elections to say, Paul's really bad, vote for Alice. Instead of Alice saying, well, Paul supports this tax increase, and I don't. So that's what really happens. Maine has had a few elections. They know what's going on. They've actually quantified how much more money has come into their elections that are very negative. I think it's like double or triple now. It's really high. And it's just by super PACs. And the last thing is gaming the system. A lot of times they say with ranked choice elections, They used the example of like a fringe candidate who, in Massachusetts, they often say this, a very far left fringe candidate who may take votes away from a Democrat and a Republican wins. And if you have ranked choice, then the left can vote for the fringe candidate, but also vote for the Democrat. Well, that's just not true. Again, Maine has had some experience. They're not too far from us. Their first ranked choice election they had was a member of Congress named Bruce Polkwin, a Republican. He got like 49.8% of the vote. Not quite 50, but very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
He had 2 independents and a Democrat run against him. One of the independents was a pro-marijuana candidate. So, take it for what it is, a single-issue fringe candidate. But the other independent was an anti-Republican, pro-Democrat candidate. So all that person did was say, whatever, vote for me, the independent, vote for the Democrat second ballot, whatever you do, don't vote for the Republican. Well, that's called gaming the system. And that's exactly what happened. The Democrat ended up winning, and he voted because of those third-party candidates, those independents. So there are ways to obviously game the system, just like any election cycle. But political activists are the ones that love this system the most. As you were kind of describing, it's the hardcore ideological political activists. These are ways for them to game the system, to get outcomes that they normally couldn't get. It allows for them to put on a pedestal very far extremist types of candidates, so now all of a sudden have some more credibility. So you'll see a lot of kind of Yahoo candidates come out of the woodwork say this is a great idea because it gives them more of a platform.
Right. And honestly, I mean, like, I know we all love to say, like, oh, the two-party system and this and that, and it's so damaging that we only have these two to pick from. But, sometimes it's actually more of a distraction and a pain in the neck to have all these extra candidates in here. And even sometimes when they have more legitimacy, like we saw in Massachusetts, when we had Evan Falchuk finally got his 3% that he needed in order to have his independent party kind of have their own ballots and be like an official party in Massachusetts. And it was a disaster because people thought the independent party was just being unenrolled, or independent, as like people just kind of colloquially call it, to not be in a party. So there were people signed up for his party, and then they didn't realize that they couldn't vote in other primaries, and the state had to send out all these letters letting them know that they weren't going to be able to vote in in the presidential primaries in 2016 because they were enrolled as this weirdo independent party that barely got 3% of the vote. Everybody had to print all these extra ballots for this party that had no candidates running in it anywhere. They're supposed to have like city and town committees for the party that nobody was in, because it was a disaster. It was just like so much extra paperwork and stupid stuff, that all this red tape that everybody had to go through because this party reached this threshold where we had to treat it like a legitimate thing, even though it wasn't. And, it really, I thought, was, and I kind of was ambivalent about it. I didn't have strong feelings about Evan Falchuk at the time when he was doing his independent run for governor. But it was a mess, and it was really damaging, I thought, for the next cycle that this had happened. So, unless it's very, very unusual that you have like serious independent candidates, like a Ross Perot kind of candidate, where it's actually adding something to the conversation and not just a stunt, like you said, for like these political operative types to give themselves something to do and a party to run. And, it's just a different type of grift, sort of the whole like independent stuff and the no labels stuff and all that kind of thing. And, fundamentally in the US, like we have the teams that we have, we have people who want higher taxes and people who want lower taxes. There's not really like an independent, there's not a third option. It's up or down. Like you can't, it just is what it is. So, I mean,
yeah,
I think that sometimes the sort of like third party, this empowers third parties and empowers independent candidates stuff is sort of not as helpful as people think it sounds like it would be in theory.
Yeah, in theory too, about this was something that during the last election, we couldn't really get into too much when we did all these debates. I mean, we did probably like 100 debates, but it wasn't a question that was often asked. But I do think there, like you said, people like to complain about the two-party system, but I do think there is some benefit to having a two-party system that needs to appeal, to the most part, to the majority, if not the plurality of voters. They have to have platforms, they have to have candidates that can appeal to large swaths of the electorate. By adding a ranked choice, what you're doing is you're allowing fringe candidates, a lot of times single issue candidates, whatever it may be, like pro-gun, pro-marijuana, whatever, find your issue, and you're allowing them to have an equal voice or a louder voice in the political process, which then takes away some of the influence that political parties are supposed to have right now to survive. So you're actually diminishing the power of political parties, and you're exalting the influence of kind of single issue topics, which may interest some people, but I don't think the vast majority of voters anywhere are really that interested. It kind of appeals to certain, I wouldn't say extremes, but certain narrowly focused voters.
Right.
So it's a whole different conversation. If you bring out ranked choice, what does that do to the two political parties long term?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it's anything good necessarily. I think that the two parties that we have are really doing a lot of the work as a sort of shorthand for people, because like we talked about, it's really hard to get people to vote in like down ballot races and all these other things, and they haven't heard of a lot of these people. And having the political parties on there really kind of lets people know roughly like a basket of issues where this person probably roughly stands, and it gives, and there's obviously exceptions to that. There are different types of Republicans and different types of Democrats. But for the average voter, you want the party on there for that reason, so that they can go in and know like which team, which side of the issues more or less people are on. And it confuses things to, be mixing it up with all these different like party labels and things. People don't have the time to be bothered with it. They want to know, is this a Republican or is this a Democrat? And it's not perfect. It's, it's tough sometimes when everything gets lumped into these sort of national big issue battles, like big culture war battles, or do you like Trump or not like Trump? But so there's disadvantages to that too. But the alternative, where people just don't vote in a lot of races because they don't know anything about any of the people who are running, because they're all like independents with a hodgepodge of positions on things, that's even harder to deal with, I think, in the end.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, Alice, that, the ranked choice did fail in Massachusetts. I think they got 45, and our side got 55%. But it was largely driven by 3 or 4 people who live out of state. And they're doing this nationally. They barely got it passed in Alaska, and they kind of added ranked choice to all sorts of other unrelated campaign finance rules in order to get it passed. But that's kind of who's driving this ship. People have to ask themselves, like, why is this being thrown on us? And that's the reason. There's 3 or 4 people nationally who, for whatever reason, think that this is a better system than any other system that's potentially out there. We're not even talking about other systems besides ranked choice in the current system, but that's what's driving this. It's also, I think, getting embedded with the Democrat Party. Although I will say, obviously, there's a lot of people that are Democrat voters who don't support it, and there's also some, people in Massachusetts who are well-known Democrats who don't support it. But what you're definitely seeing is that the ranked choice folks are definitely trying to target the fringe left of the Democrat Party to make it this kind of ideal system for voting that a lot of times doesn't actually work. But it's kind of like socialism, right? Socialism sounds really good on paper.
Right.
We all work for the common goal. We don't have to put each other down to advance. And, it has these kind of these talking points, these selling items that may sound good, but practically speaking, it never has ever worked.
True ranked choice voting has never been tried.
Very rarely ever really works.
So, and they want to tell us, we've never tried it.
One of the systems we talked a lot about. Go ahead, Alice. I'm sorry, I was
Oh,
cutting
no.
you off.
That's okay. No, I was just saying it's like true ranked choice voting has never been tried the same way it's like, oh, real socialism has never been tried. Oh, those were dictatorships. Stalin didn't have it right. New York got it wrong. Their board of elections just isn't good at this. It's not what's going to happen everywhere else when we do it.
Yeah, right. Sure. Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know if
But do you want to talk about also what happened this week?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the Supreme Court too, because this was really good news. So we talked a little about the Arizona laws, but there was another big decision that came down this week from SCOTUS, and this has been a big one for Mass Fiscal in particular, but lots and lots of groups. I mean, like the ACLU and Planned Parenthood also, wanted this to end up this way. So this isn't really a right versus left thing, but go ahead, talk a little bit about like what this decision is going to mean nationally, because this is a big one.
It was I call it the AFP versus California. It's Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus, I think it was first like Kamala Harris and now it's Garcia.
Mm-hmm.
But it's basically a case in California that in the lower courts went the way that I would like it, and eventually, and I think an appeal court went the wrong way. So then it was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they decided to take it this past year. But basically what it means is that nonprofit organizations, so these are associations of individuals and, other entities, corporations, I guess unions as well. But it's nonprofit organizations in California, just for the sake of doing business in their state, had to disclose all of their members who donate $5,000 or more to the state of California. And that's something called a Schedule B in their tax filings, which is called a 990. And that document, the Schedule B, is not supposed to be made public, but California says that they need it because they want to make sure there's no fraud that goes on. The IRS also mandates this form just with 501c3 organizations. So it's a national rule that in a state they decided to do it as well, and eventually got to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, I think they mostly relied on some of the old talking points from the civil rights era on this issue. What's been so fascinating with this whole topic, if you care about it, that is, because it's a very narrowly focused issue, is that during the civil rights era, we actually debated all these topics back then. And it was playing out down south where you had civil rights nonprofit groups that were pretty loosely formed, that were trying to advance their rights, rightly so, down south. And yet southern racist Democrats making the arguments back then that they're making today, which is we just want to know who are these associations being funded by, who are their members. The public has a right to know if they're trying to influence public policy or conversations, that we should know who are these people. So back then in the 1950s, the Supreme Court actually ruled in a unanimous decision that, what do you think is going to happen when you make these membership rosters public? There's going to be a lot of harassment, intimidation, etc. More recently, what you're starting to see is the left. Some aspects of the vocal left are making those same arguments, but now they're calling it dark money. They're trying to use some other confusing buzzwords to paint over the fact that this is exactly what was being said during the civil rights era against minority organizations. In the state of California, this case played out, and what they were saying a little bit more was that what we're trying to do is prevent fraud. So we want to know who all these donors are. This way we can prevent fraud because they're taking tax benefits. And the Supreme Court basically said no. The government doesn't have a real need for this information. They can always get it if they suspect fraud, and they go through the normal procedures of going to court for this information, but they don't need it just for the sake of needing it.
Right. They don't need to be hanging on to a list of everybody.
Folks that care about the First Amendment. Yeah. And it's been very interesting to see it play out because the left has started to embrace this position of donor disclosure, which results in intimidation. What I've always argued is that disclosure is good for government, privacy is good for individuals, and we have to remember that. We want government officials to be disclosed in what they're doing, but private citizens should not be subject to these types of disclosure rules because private citizens have rights for their speech and association. It's a First Amendment. When you try to dox private citizens and their associations, it leads to harassment. We all have seen it many times happen. And you hear some of the talking points by the left, which is, oh, the harassment that happened in the civil rights era doesn't happen today. And obviously that's not true. There's a lot of people out there who get all sorts of crazy threats, including myself at Mass Fiscal. I've had to file police reports against people, go to court for this kind of stuff because, in the modern world, people get really strong opinions with what goes on in public policy to a point that's unhealthy at times.
Right.
But that's essentially what the Supreme Court said. They're going to continue to keep the First Amendment strong, the freedom of association, the freedom of speech. And that's a good thing as we head into this Independence Day weekend.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're getting to, if I wanted to start a group that wanted to advocate about, say, like abortion or something and just, talk about it as a policy and work towards, making information known about it that wasn't tied to a specific election, I have the right to do that and say that. And that's my political speech. And if somebody wants to, give me money to help me put out that message, then I don't have to, give their names in a list to the government. And like one of the things I thought was so interesting reading these decisions in this case in particular was that the group Americans for Prosperity was actually able to show that the state of California had no capability to keep that information confidential at all, that their website was completely not secure, that this information was out there. And like you said, like it's absolutely not the case that there's not harassment. I mean, back in 2008, the guy at Mozilla had to quit his job because there was so much harassment because he dared to donate against the gay marriage ballot question. And, just as another example, the people that donated to Kyle Rittenhouse's defense, that information got hacked and leaked. And I mean, some of those people were like cops that had to leave departments that were fired and laid off because their hacked information was put out there by people. This is a real risk. And like, I think this is so important to keep people able to say and do and associate with who they want. Like you said, like, happy 4th of July. Thank God for the Supreme Court and, keeping us able to have this kind of political discourse, because some of our friends on the left, like you said, are very passionate about these things to the point where it's like a religious belief with them, on some of this stuff. And they just can't imagine having to live in a world where somebody out there disagrees with them, even if it's disagrees with them secretly in a way that's not affecting them at all, and it's so misguided. Like, I don't honestly believe that money affects directly elections and policy that much. At the end of the day, people have the opinions that they're going to have. It's like the stuff with the Russia interventions in 2016. Like, I just don't think that because somebody bought some Facebook ads about Hillary Clinton in Wisconsin was why it went that way. Like, I have more faith in people than that, I guess, that, and then a couple of Facebook ads weren't what got somebody who was going to go out and vote for Hillary Clinton to change their mind,
Yeah.
I mean, we saw that.
This is a great decision by the Supreme Court. And even though as Americans for Prosperity, they actually had a lot of different other organizations that signed on, I believe, as amicus briefs, a lot of groups that were from the left or from, libertarian thinking. It really brought in a lot of different perspectives because, I think they saw the value in the fact that the First Amendment is worth fighting for. Freedom of association, freedom of speech. And it's not so much that people necessarily shouldn't come forward if we're certain member organizations. It's that they are the ones that should set those terms. If they want to come forward, they can. But other people don't have the right. And oftentimes what I get asked this question a lot, this topic, and I say, look, I don't have the right to go to the Boston Globe and say, I want your membership roll. I don't have a right to go to a business and say, I want your customer roll. They don't have a right to come into a nonprofit organization and say, I want your membership roll. Because these organizations have rights. They actually do. It's constitutional rights. Yes, these organizations aren't people. They're not voting, but they do have constitutional rights. And the First Amendment was upheld in this case. So, some people, some organizations will make their members public. Mass Fiscal, we have a board of directors. That is public. So, it's not saying that when people do come forward, it's a bad thing. It just means that they are the ones that are setting those terms. Up to them to do that. And it's not someone else's right more than those individuals' right who want to associate and have speech.
Right. And I think that that it's almost disappointing to me that that none of the liberal justices joined in on this, because I do think it's kind of a value that should be shared across the board. And like you said, there have been past cases like this that have been unanimous. And, I was also kind of disappointed for that reason because, I think that it's really good in a lot of ways for people to see the Supreme Court justices voting across what they consider to be the ideological lines. These two cases this week happened to be decided 6-3, on kind of the lines you would expect, where the justices appointed by Republicans went one way and the justices appointed by Democrats went the other way. But, just before that, we had another two cases where it was a total mix, and we had Gorsuch and Kagan over here and this person over here, and there was no rhyme or reason. Amy Coney Barrett, that we were getting told was going to gut Obamacare, that they were pushing to get her in so that she could destroy Obamacare forever, voted, against the lawsuit against Obamacare. She voted to keep Obamacare the way it was on this severability case that I think most people agree was just not a very compelling case legally. And I think that people forget sometimes that the issues that come up in front of the Supreme Court aren't necessarily about the political outcome that you want to see. It wasn't, the question in front of the Supreme Court wasn't, do you like Americans for Prosperity? Do you like the Koch brothers? That wasn't the question they were deciding. Mm-hmm. The question was a sort of very specific legal question. And I think I have a lot of faith in our Supreme Court still, that I think these justices are really trying to decide the matters of the law in front of them, as they really think they are. And of course, they do come from different ideological places, but a lot of times you do see them crossing the lines of, political party, which is so great. That's why we have the Supreme Court, where they're not elected, where they don't have to respond to these political pressures, because they don't have to worry about what the voters think of something. They can just consider very narrowly the legal issues that are in front of them. And, I think it would be good if we could ramp down the rhetoric about the Supreme Court being compromised and Biden needing to pack it with 4 more justices or whatever. That would be so bad for our country. It's really, really a good thing that we have this body that decides things sort of separately from all the hysteria of the day-to-day political back and forth.
Yeah, and it was funny, right after this decision came out, Senator Markey came out and reaffirmed his support for packing the court, which just shows you, to your point, these justices don't have to live in the world of politics that these politicians, gladly do. And it is so refreshing to see the court come to their own decisions the way they have. And it is kind of annoying, though, with this AFP case, that the 3 more liberal justices didn't join the majority. I mean, again, I saw that, I think it was Kagan was saying something to the effect of, well, you're allowing California to do its job to make sure there's no corruption. Therefore, that was her position. I was just, I don't know. I mean, the bigger picture is obviously out there. And I think the justices took, they decided because of that. And it was just kind of sad to see some of the 3 other justices not join. Because to me, it seems like a real no-brainer, especially when you look at all the different groups that came forward to support the AFP case.
Right. I mean, how often do you have the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center and, these Koch-funded groups agreeing on something? That's really, I would think that would be pretty compelling to people. But all I see on social media, it's just it makes me tired. because it just goes on like, oh, the Supreme Court is so political, and the Koch brothers got what they paid for when they paid for Kavanaugh's debts up, like just this imaginary world stuff of things that aren't really happening. And I'm like, do you read any Supreme Court decisions? Because it's actually not that often that cases are decided on these ideological lines. It's kind of unusual. There's always people crossing over. It's always, but no one wants to hear that. That's like too nuanced and complicated, that, you know, justices are people too who are trying to do their job and think about the law and what it means. And you know, it's one of those things that like makes me frustrated with the state of the conversation that we're having nationally, because it doesn't seem to me that it's like the most useful or helpful conversation. I mean, maybe it drives clicks on CNN's website or something to say that like the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act this week. But I just like, I find it so frustrating that we're not talking about the real world. We're talking about like this fantasy world game that isn't really what's happening out there. So I don't know. That was like the state of my week. I was like, I have to talk about this on the podcast and get it off my chest that everything is like, everybody's lost their minds or something. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I agree.
But yeah, I mean, it's been a long week, but fortunately, hopefully there'll be a little break from news over this weekend. So I'm hoping that everybody can get out there, breathe the fresh air. COVID's pretty much over, so you can go be with your family, have a cookout, relax, and you know, everybody can calm down a little bit, and maybe things will be better when we get back from the long weekend. I'm hoping. But anyway, thank you for coming on the eve of the 4th of July definitely. Weekend. I know it's a crazy time, but I appreciate it so much, and it was a great conversation. Hopefully I'll talk to you soon.
Clouds rolled in and I said, must have brought the rain from Boston. But you looked at me and I felt the sun.